What's up, guys? We're back with another video. It is Thursday, January 8th, and we are going to talk about some stuff going on in the news and some bigger picture context that I think is applicable to the current hot thing in the news. That thing being this woman that was shot in Minneapolis at like the ICE protests. And I'm not going to go too much into sort of the details of that. It's very, like, there's a very clear dividing line online, at least for people's opinions. If you're left wing, you believe this woman was murdered in cold blood. She did nothing wrong. The ICE agent that shot her is like a terrorist or whatever, and this is all, I mean, they already had their mind made up that ICE is evil and deporting people is evil and all that stuff. So that's that perspective. And then if you are more broadly on the right, you are supposed to say that, well, should have listened to the cop and fucked around, found out. And, well, that's what you get when you don't, when you do something like this. If I was going to offer my opinion on it, it would be kind of a mixture. The lady put herself in an unnecessarily dangerous situation and then freaked out, and law enforcement officers are not Neo in the Matrix. They cannot slow down time and have perfect situational awareness. And it's sad, but I think it's also very sad that politics puts people in these sort of mindsets where they are willing to endanger themselves to no benefit. People are saying, oh, well, this is so awful because she was a mother. It's like, yes, it's awful that she was a mother, and it's awful that this guy killed her. It's also awful that politics corrupted this lady's mind to the point where she was willing to put herself in the situation. And so, I guess I would have a pretty, I'd like to call it a nuanced take, but it's really a take where I'm like, I don't know, stuff like this is bound to happen when you have this sort of escalating rise in tension amongst the left and the right over immigration policy. You have left-wing politicians like Tim Walz encouraging, at best you could say, protests, but as we've seen with BLM, many of these protests are bound to turn into riots based on the rhetoric that's being used to get them to start. And so overall, I'm kind of indifferent to this story. It's not good on any side. Lady shouldn't have put herself in that position. Cop should not have stepped in front of the vehicle and should not have pulled the trigger and killed the lady. So, everybody is culpable for what the outcome ended up being. Now, the thing that I find much more interesting about this story, and the reason that I'm going to talk about this story at all, is because in my perspective, I see this as one in a long string, a really, decades long continuation of these type of sort of big moments in politics and how they're weaponized by the media and by politicians to further just like entrench each side into their perspective. And, this happens all the time, and it is one of the most common tools of political actors, whether that be politicians, media, corporate cronies. They all kind of latch onto these types of events and use them to try to further entrench each side of the sort of political dialectic between left and right. So, this is like a long-term strategy that's been happening for a long time. I think one of the most useful sort of illustrations of this happening, and sort of one of the most appalling ones if you go back into not too distant history, is what's called Operation Gladio. And so Operation Gladio is essentially after World War II. Of course, Eastern Europe was completely dominated by the Soviet Union. And now that the Nazis had been defeated, the West broadly, as in, the US, Britain, France, sort of like what became the NATO countries, and I guess this was after NATO had been created, they had this sort of this nexus of intelligence agencies, like CIA, MI6 or 5, I forget which one is their CIA and which is their FBI equivalent. But the intelligence agencies of these various countries kind of collaborated on this joint operation where they would create what was called stay-behind networks. And these were networks of, intelligence assets. I don't want to say they were agents of the intelligence agencies, but they were assets of them for sure. And they would put them in these sort of like all the countries that were kind of on the border, like of the communist bloc countries, and in some cases in the communist bloc countries. And these were meant to, the reason they're called stay-behind networks is because if the Soviets were able to either capture or annex or absorb one of these countries into the Union, the Soviet Union, then the Western adversaries to the Soviet Union would already have networks set up in order to undermine political processes in these countries. And even before the absorption or the annexation would happen, these networks were also set up to sort of like infiltrate political power networks, and also in some of the more egregious cases commit terrorist acts that could then be blamed on pro-Soviet Union factions of that country. And this is kind of like, I think to me in politics, like I do very much enjoy what's going on as far as sort of the news, the day-to-day, the geopolitics, the domestic politics, the different factions that you see in Congress and the Senate and all that stuff. I am sort of a political nerd where I like watching the show. But what I would say is that overall, the show is much more taking place behind the scenes. The show is much more parapolitical than political. And by that I mean, like, I would say my personal assessment of what goes on in, let's just stick with American politics for a second, is that we talk about the executive and judiciary and legislative branches. Those are our three branches of government, right? That's where the separation of powers and that's how our system supposedly functions, right? Is sort of within the three branches of government. Now, what I would say is that's a load of bullshit, because truthfully, the real nexus of power in this country is not in any of those three branches of government. It is those being part of the power structure in the country. But I would say that should actually be one branch of government. Then all these sort of these non-elected, non-rotating entities are actually one of the other big power nexuses. So that would be like the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, and then the other big power nexus in our politics is the media. So all that to say is that I think much more of the action goes on, and you will have a much more comprehensive understanding of what's going on if you acknowledge and recognize and monitor what is going on with the intelligence agencies and what their goals are and what their track record is. I think that's much more where the action is, and sort of like the partisan political divide is kind of just like a show being put on for the mass populace to kind of corral them into the two different camps that we kind of have in our system, and play those two camps, the left and the right broadly in America, play them off of each other and use one to create reactions in the other. And I think that is largely done with the directing of the intelligence agencies and whoever is above the intelligence agencies. I'm not saying that the director of the FBI or the CIA is the one who is necessarily calling the shots. I'm just saying that that apparatus as a whole is much more powerful than people tend to give it credit for. And so a lot of these sort of big events that get people all riled up, and especially the events that kind of make a clear delineation between how you're supposed to feel about this if you're on team left and how you're supposed to feel about this if you're on team right. And I would say that a lot of these events, I'm not saying that they're necessarily false flags in the sense that they're created or like actually acted out with the coordination. Like, I don't think that's normally how it works, although it does work that way sometimes. False flags are real, and there have definitely been intelligence agency orchestrated plots that were meant to achieve the same goal. One of these, I would say, that we just had our 5th anniversary of was January 6th. I think that was totally orchestrated. I think the number of federal agents that were in the crowd, many of whom were shown to be corralling the rioters into the Capitol and all of that. I think that's a perfect illustration of exactly what I'm talking about when it is orchestrated. But many of the other times, like this, for instance, I don't think like the FBI or the CIA was like, okay, well, we're going to find an ICE agent and we're going to whisper in his ear and tell him, hey, like, go shoot some lady in the head. I don't think that's how it works. I think what more so happened is that once the event happens, those same sort of entities collude together and collude with the media and collude with their allied politicians to create a narrative and sort of further entrench the two sides onto their halves of the political spectrum. And in sort of the worst perspective of how this works is also a callback to Operation Gladio, which is what was called within that sort of time period as a strategy of tension, which is essentially like we create some sort of terrorist act or like deep event, like some people will call or will allege that, like, say, like many of the mass shootings and stuff like that are part of this. And that's when you kind of go full into schizo territory with MK Ultra and trauma-based mind control, and which I'm not averse to. I do believe that there's a lot of truth in those sort of assessments of especially these sort of historical events. But essentially, like, the strategy of tension is this constant, like, creating a reaction from whatever side you're targeting, based on this thing or that thing. And, I think that if you kind of like research this stuff and you do go down these sort of like schizo rabbit holes about Gladio, and there's other operations that are similar to this, like Phoenix, Condor, and like I said, when you get full into the ramifications of like projects like MK Ultra, I do think those allow a window into a different level of politics that most people never even encounter in a real way, at least. They kind of treat it as like this sci-fi, the science fiction. Like MK Ultra is, oh yeah, well, the CIA was trying to figure out how to control people's minds through trauma and, psychedelic drug use and stuff like that. But first of all, they never figured it out, because that's crazy. And second of all, they stopped doing it decades ago, and I think that's just wrong. And it's very obvious that, in my opinion, that some of the lessons, I'm not saying that they were able to ever like actually create a Manchurian candidate, somebody that they could completely brainwash and get to do things, but maybe if you know the story of like RFK Sr. and Sirhan, maybe. But I think the more applicable part of this to what I'm talking about right now is that they took the lessons that they found through those research experiments, especially trauma-based mind control. And they figured out how to do that on a mass scale. They figured out how to use corporate media and these sort of like huge events that happen, like whether or not they're carried out and planned and carried out by these same people is kind of irrelevant to the point, because it's like, okay, once they happen, whether it was just like whatever, a lone shooter, or in this case the ICE agent, or in, you know, whatever, so they've happened now. Whoever's responsible, whether it's a lone individual or it's a grander conspiracy, once they happen, they know how to use these events to push the different factions towards a prescription that always benefits their power and their grasp on power and the growth of their power. And so, in my opinion, this is just another one of these many events that will be and always are exploited to the benefit of consolidation of power in Washington, to uphold the left-right paradigm in this country that is pretty much eating this country alive. The left-right, like, I'm not saying like, I'm not of the belief that like, oh, well, come on guys, we should just meet in the middle and all get along. That's not my perspective at all. I think that's stupid, and I am not, you know, like, I'm not one of these people that's like, oh, well, I'm just a moderate, we should all meet in the middle. It's like, no, I don't believe that. However, all these sort of cultural events that happen are clearly designed in order for this dialectic to continue and play out. And the effect that that has is that no problems ever get solved. Politics continues to devolve into this team sports spectacle. And you can't even really, with most people, have a thorough and honest conversation about any sort of specific policy choice, because every specific policy choice that you, or sort of preference that you have, puts you into one of the camps. And so there is no debate to be had, or middle ground to be found, or even like separation and go our different ways to be had. Because if you come from either the left or right wing perspective, as it is now, you view your adversaries in politics it as like an evil empire that must be defeated, that must be brought to heel, and that must be dominated. And I think that paradigm has brought us to where we are, and will continue to sort of play out over who knows how long, as long as people are still doing this, which is, I don't know if it's unavoidable. It could be. But yeah, I guess that's sort of like what this whole thing made me think of. I really don't find the story that interesting. I think that there are many people on the left that are hyper emotional about this story right now. But, you know, politics is like always creating these tragic situations. And I don't care which party you align with, like, your party is doing evil things that kills people every day, or at best, like, steals people's livelihoods, which is the same thing as enslaving them. And so, I think a lot of these people are well-meaning. Like, they don't have like bad intent, and they are really just bleeding hearts. But if you're a bleeding heart and like you are emotional about political stories, like whatever the hot political story du jour is, like if you're getting emotional about it, you should like put down your phone and forget about it like forever. You should not be involved in politics if you're like crying over some lady that you don't know that put herself in a really stupid situation and got killed. I mean, people die every day. I mean, to understand like what's actually happening in politics, and then to cry over every person who dies at the hand of some, either military or, law enforcement officer or just like some criminal's hand, because most of the criminals in our country are allowed to be criminals that like, so if you're going to cry about every sad story that happens, like you're focusing too much on politics and you don't have enough in your own life going on that like, I think it's kind of just like this sort of, let's focus on these things that I have no control over instead of taking control over my life where I actually have some agency in most cases. So, yeah, it's unfortunate this lady died. But, if you're gonna use this as a justification for why more rioting should occur, why more protesting should occur, and especially the political class that is pushing this line, don't be surprised when more of this happens. Like, it's the obvious outcome. And I'm anti-immigration, so I do sympathize with the right wing on this, but I think that they're doing a really horrific job at selling this. Like, they should just own it and say, yeah, the guy shouldn't have shot her, but like I said, it's like you can't expect people to have like perfect situational awareness and be super calm and collected while in the midst of this like chaotic scene. So I don't know. It's just but I do just see this as another thing that's going to be pushed to further a narrative on both sides. And, that's why we can't have any serious political conversation in this country. It's all just, it's all team sports, and it's sad, but I guess that is what it is, Welcome to politics. So, if you're interested in learning a little bit about Operation Gladio and sort of what I was talking about a little bit in this episode, I would really suggest the book. It's just called Operation Gladio, I'm pretty sure. The author is Paul L. Williams, and it'll give you the history of that. But I just think, broadly speaking, people should be aware of how much input the intelligence agencies have over what happens in the country, and how deep those sort of power struggles go. It's much, stuff. Most of the interesting stuff does not happen in Congress or on the television. Much of the interesting stuff is going on behind the scenes. So keep that in mind, and don't fall for the media slop that's fed to you. Unless, if you've already picked a team and that's your thing, then whatever. I'm not going to save you or change your mind probably, but As always, if you watched to the end, really appreciate it. Let me know what you think. Am I an evil right-winger supporting the cops? Am I an evil commie saying that the cop had culpability for this happening? Am I schizo-pilled? Yes. But yeah, I'll be back next week sometime, do another video. We'll see what's happening in the news. In the meantime, do all the things, like, comment, subscribe, share. Go follow me on Instagram, Skyler_Carns. That's SKYLER_KARNS. And yeah, that's it. You guys have a good weekend and do your best to stay sane out there. All right, later.